I'm just going to hold the book up. So here it is. Can you see that? Shores of Paradise by John Smart. And I read it with great pleasure earlier this year. It's a wonderful biography, beautifully written, beautifully presented, and an incredibly interesting life. And I hope we're going to hear a lot more about the life of Jack Squire from John. So John's credentials are quite interesting as well. Looking inside the cover here, he's taught in prep schools, secondary schools, colleges, and universities, and interestingly, RAF bases. So a very wide-ranging curriculum there. But his literary output has been quite tightly focused on modernism, so English modernism, and Jack Squire and his sort of encounters with English modernism are something we're hopefully going to hear something about. But I do strongly recommend this book. And I also strongly recommend that you make a donation, of course, to the Lit and Phil. I've already done that. So you can go onto the website afterwards and do that very, very easily. So over to John, and I look forward to the talk. I'm going to go on mute now, so I hope you'll all do the same.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, Keith, for your very kind words, and Kay for your brilliant organisation, and the Lit and Phil for inviting me to talk to you this evening. It's an honour and a privilege for me to talk to you tonight about Sir John Squire. I can imagine that some of you just about remember reading a poem of his, or recalling a parody. Or perhaps you remember him as the hero of the funniest literary cricket match. Or perhaps his name just rang a distant bell. But it is not surprising that many of you will not know who I am talking about, for he has been almost completely forgotten. And yet, at the time of the First World War, and for the next 10 years, he was one of the most important literary figures in London as poet, critic, and journalist. Praised by some as the best critic of his time, he was also loathed and feared by others. The combined attacks on him and his friends by a group of writers we now call modernists, Eliot, Woolf, and Pound, destroyed his reputation and resulted in his near oblivion today. I have called my talk The Last Man of Letters, because I think the term shows something about changing ideas, about literature and society. The very phrase, man of letters, sounds dated and old-fashioned, and the idea behind it may be so as well. A man of letters is, of course, a writer, but he is much more than that. A man of letters indicates a position in society and an interest in a wider culture. The term perhaps harks back to Victorian sages such as Arnold or Ruskin or Carlyle. Would we call any writer today a man of letters? I don't think so. If we wouldn't, why would we not do so? I hope that the life of Squire will give a background and some explanation to the apparent disappearance of the man of letters. The word modernism needs a brief context. I have used it to describe that kind of experimental writing that thrived just after the First World War and dominated the literary world for the next 20 years. Its leading figures are Eliot, Pound, and Joyce. And of course, Virginia Woolf. I've put together at the beginning of my book a composite account of how the modernist viewed Squire and his friends, and it's a view which still largely holds today, 100 years on. And here is my attempt at this composite view. At the beginning of the 20th century, the fat and complacent Jack Squire led a group of reactionary poets who dominated and controlled English poetry and publishing. They were little Englanders who looked backwards, resisted modernism, and shut their eyes to all the artistic developments that were happening in Paris and London and Europe. They called themselves Georgians, but became known as the Squirearchy, cricket-playing men who wrote watered-down escapist poetry about larks, nightingales, and a countryside that had largely ceased to exist. It's my task today to present another viewpoint. So, who was Sir John Squire, and why does he matter? John Collins Squire was a Victorian, born in a terraced house in Plymouth in 1884. After winning scholarships to Blundell's School and St John's College, Cambridge, he made his way as a poet and became the leading parodist of his day on the radical magazine, The New Age. Here, for example, is Squire on the fashionable Vogue, or Irish poetry. He called his poem Numerous Celts. There's a grey wind wails on the clover, and grey hills, and mist around the hills, and a far voice sang a song that is over, and my grey heart that a strange longing fills. A sheen of dead swords that shake upon the wind, and a harp that sleeps through the wind is blowing over the hills and the seas and the great hills behind, the great hills of Kerry, where my heart would be going. For I would be in Kerry now, where quiet is the grass, and the birds are crying in the low light, and over the stone hedges the shadows pass, and a fiddle weeps at the shadow of the night, with Pat Dugan, Father Mercy, brown maidens, King Cuchulainn, the kine, the sheep, some old women, some old men, and Uncle White Seagull and all. Chorus, and Uncle White Seagull and all. Many people have noticed that that kind of parody is so close to the real thing that it might almost be the real thing. And some people feel that it is Squire's love of the kind of verse that he parodies that is also present in that poem and that approach. Going from the poem to the page. He published 2 volumes of his own poetry and soon became associated with the runaway poetic bestseller of the time. And these were the 5 Georgian anthologies that in their time sold more than 100,000 copies. It was a public for poetry that has never been recaptured and that many poets today would envy a great deal. When war came in 1914, his bad eyesight ruled him out of the army, but it was a chance that was good for him, as so many young men were away fighting, Belgium and France, and London was denuded of young writers and young poets. Squire made his name writing as literary editor of The Observer, and his witty comments on books set him apart from most other war writers. He was now an agnostic, and religious calls on God's aid from both sides met with his sarcastic reply. His poem, The Dilemma, quoted and requoted at the time, but rarely attributed to him, pointed out the tragic absurdity of both sides appealing to the same God for his protection and victory. And perhaps we remember Bob Dylan's poem of the same kind. This is it. God heard the embattled nations sing and shout, God struck England, and God saved the king. God this, God that, and God the other thing. Good God, said God, I've got my work cut out. Whatever the war was, Squire knew as it was not a crusade. At the same time, as Squire's career was developing quickly, a more experimental kind of verse and writing was also growing in opposition. Virginia Woolf famously claimed that on or about December 1910, human nature changed. And of course, art had to change with it. And gave us the trumpet call of modernism. Make it new. In 1917, D.H. Lawrence published The Rainbow to a shocked public. In poetry, the new movement found its shape in imagism, and its leading exponents were the American poets Ezra Pound, H.D., and Amy Lowell. Squire thought that these stunts, as he called them, were at best silly and at worst a cover for a poet with very little talent. Ezra Pound, he thought, was either silly or incomprehensible. Pound's two-line poem called La, so 1910, was the former. Green arsenic smeared on an egg-white cloth, crushed strawberries, come, let us feast our eyes. Squire was quick with his parody, Vers Libre, entitled, a very new poet had written The Lotus Eaters, and this is famous. Bring me 6 cushions, a yellow one, a green one, a purple one, an orange one, an ultramarine one, and a vermilion one, colours of which the combination pleases my eye. Bring me also 6 lemon squashes and a straw. Well, looked on these new vogues of poetry with amusement, hostility, and dismay. And he used all the means at his disposal to treat them and reveal them as the wrong turnings or the frauds he thought they really were. 2 events strengthened his position as the leading literary man of the time. The first was the founding in 1919 of the Hawthornden Prize, which was the first literary prize in England. Squire headed a very small panel. His aim was to reward and recognise young talent, and he set a barrier at the age of 40 years. His enemies thought, with some justice, that he chose only his friends and allies for the award. The Hawthornden Prize became the focus of the revenge of a very important modernist writer, Edith Sitwell. Osbert, her brother, wrote an article entitled Jolly Old Squire and Shanks's Mare Nest. Osbert posed as a racing tipster called the Major, and he set out the runners and the odds for the next Hawthornden Stakes. Mr. Freeman writes for the London Mercury. Mr. J.C. Squire is editor of the London Mercury. Mr. J.C. Squire is chief literary critic of the Observer. Iolo I.O.U. Williams, a poet, writes for the London Mercury, of which Mr. J.C. Squire is editor, and reviewed Mr. J.C. Squire's book of poems for the Observer, of which Mr. J.C. Squire is chief literary critic. Mr. Squire has now written a preface to an anthology edited by Mr. Iolo Williams. The Major, writing from Newmarket, advises sportsmen to back Mr. Iolo Williams as a future Hawthornden Prize winner. The Sitwells decided to present a literary prize of their own, a spoof of the Hawthornden, a stuffed owl awarded for the dullest literary work of the year. The event was that kind of political theatre and comedy and farce at which the Sitwells excelled. The owl was Sitwell's aim at the eagle himself, as Squire called himself sometimes, Solomon Eagle, and all the rest of the bird-loving Georgians. The first recipients of the stuffed birds were, of course, Jack Squire, Edward Shanks, his deputy, and Harold Nicholson. And when the supply of owls ran out, Nicholson was awarded a stuffed mangy cat and a few diseased mice under a huge glass dome. The second event that helped to make Squire's fortune came when in 1919 he launched his literary magazine, the London Mercury. It soon became the best read publication of its type, selling up to 20,000 copies a month. The modernists saw it as another platform for Squire's views and looked with horror at his control of the publication. In January, T.S. Eliot wrote to an American colleague, "The London Mercury, which started with a great deal of advertisement, will, I hope, fail in a few years' time. It is run by a small clique of bad writers. J.C. Squire, the editor, knows nothing about poetry, but he is the cleverest journalist in London. If he succeeds, it will be impossible to get anything published." And from Eliot, of course, the phrase, "the cleverest journalist in London," was not praise. Quarrel between the Squirearchy, as it came to be called, and the modernists was ultimately a battle over the nature and future of poetry and the ways in which it could reach its audience. Magazines were, Eliot knew, the power block of poetry. His main target was the Mercury. He felt that Squire had a godlike control over 5 or 6 key outlets. The only exceptions were the Times, the Athenaeum, and the Art and Letters. He wrote the following poem, mocking Squire. God from a cloud to Squire spoke, and breathed command, "Take thou this rod, and smite therewith the living rock." And Squire hearkened unto God, and Squire smote the living rock. And lo, the living rock was wet, whence issue punctual as the clock. Land and Water, the New Statesman, the London Mercury, and the Westminster Gazette. However, the tide was beginning to turn against Squire and his friends. It was time for modernists such as Eliot to regroup. Critic John Middleton Murray, married to Catherine Mansfield and a central figure in the world of the modernists, was bitterly opposed to Squire, as Eliot was, and everything he stood for. He had no doubt that the lines were drawn up ready for a fight for survival. He described what was at stake to his wife in gladiatorial terms and signed himself Tiger. This is what he wrote. "The anti-Athenaeums, Jack Squire, etc., present in force. There's no doubt it's a fight to the finish between us and them. Them is the Georgians en masse. It's a square feeling I have now that we're making literary history, but I believe we are going to. More than that, in spite of the London Mercury, I believe we've got them on the run. They're afraid." Their arguments became theatre at the Conference Hall, Westminster. The Arts League of Service, an idealistic group formed in October 19 as a parallel to the League of Nations, organised an autumn programme of 4 talks on modern tendencies in the arts. The programme was itself a modernist statement. Designed by a friend of Eliot's, it showed a stylised figure of an outsized man spanning a bridge. On one side was a medieval town, and the other was a modern city. The message was obvious. Man was about to step from the medieval world into the modern world. On the 28th of October, more than 300 artists and poets and musicians packed into the hall to hear this 31-year-old American poet and critic, T.S. Eliot, give the second lecture in the series. Strange as it seems now, it is a fact to admire his poetry in 1919 was daring and revolutionary, wrote Richard Aldington, his friend. The audience contained many of the Athenaeums, including Edith Sitwell, Edward Dent, the modernist novelist Sidney Schill, his wife, and Middleton Murray himself. Lawrence Benyon was the chairman, and the Georgians were out in force, led by Squire. Eliot, in his talk, was careful not to praise Edward Ezra Pound or to criticise Rupert Brooke. Afterwards, he wrote that he was very anxious to avoid putting his foot in it and saying anything that might bring down popular fury against him. In his lecture, he developed the idea of the impersonality of poetry with the analogy of the work of the poet to that of the scientist. Like science, it had to grow and develop from the discoveries of the past. Poetry could no longer be, as he called it, the mere ebullition of personality. The greater the poet, the more evident the hand is in every line, and the more elusive his personality. After his lecture, there were questions. Eliot faced the heavy fire of heckling from Squire and his friends. These were new and challenging ideas. Squire listened as Eliot developed an idea of poetry that was antipathetic to everything he believed. It was completely strange to his own sense of poetry as more romantic and hostile to the traditional view of poetry as the expression of feelings. Whereas Eliot talked of impersonality and science, Squire felt that the more personality, the better. And frankly, he had little interest in science. This year is the centenary of what has come to be seen as the annus mirabilis of modernism. Eliot's The Waste Land, Joyce's Ulysses, have been the sort of twin pillars of the change that occurred in that year. At the time of their publication in 1922, Eliot was still seen as a wild man, and censorship meant that Ulysses could not be published in England. Squire, in fact, was unconvinced by either of what have been called the two towering works of the 20th century. He had managed to acquire a copy of Ulysses, which was smuggled into his office from Sylvia Beach's bookshop in France. He buried it amongst his capacious files, and it lay hidden until it was discovered, and at that point, he asked his secretary, burn it. In fact, he was puzzled by The Waste Land. After reading it several times, he told his readers that he could not make head or tail of it, but he didn't think it was a fake, and conceded that Eliot must have been at great pains to express himself. In his review in the London Mercury, he was more stern. A grunt would serve equally well, he summed it up. 3 years later, Squire reviewed side by side two very different works that came out in 1925. These were his friend Edmund Blunden's English poems and Eliot's poems 1909 to 1925. Eliot's character and poetry continued to puzzle and perhaps almost to obsess Squire. He respected him as a critic. Some of his poetry he admired, but he couldn't understand Eliot's reserved character, and he was sure that his muted dejection was not likely to produce any good poetry. He thought that the more full-blooded emotions of hate or love, passion, were the real stuff of poetry. Eliot's poems seemed to him, by contrast, an elaborate expression of disgust, Baudelaire without the guts, as he called it. Why on earth should Eliot bother to write at all, he wondered. All he could produce was a vagrant sequence of images of the exhaustion of our civilization. He certainly failed the test that Squire always made: comprehensibility. He believed that clear communication was necessary for poetry as for all writing. On that count, Wasteland failed completely. The poet Edith Sitwell, outraged by the review, wrote to Eliot, "I'm determined that Squire should be punished now. If he isn't, we shall have him teaching the Archangel Gabriel how to play his trumpet in heaven." Squire, in return, turned to his pen. He made fun of Eliot's obscurity in this parody and Sitwell's fondness for all things exotic and unreal in a poem he called Piebald Unicorn. Under the hyperthyroid moon, seated, I shall eat caviar with a spoon, while Mr. Noakes, that melancholy man, will cool my heated features with his fan. The ghost of sated Elagabalus will sometimes come to drink his tea with us. Gazelles and eunuchs, crystal as a leaf, will pace the rose beds to assuage my grief. I shall applaud their steps, and when I please, lean forth to stroke their thin anatomies, while Mr. Noakes, that melancholy man, discourses gentle music with his fan. Coffee spoons with which Prufrock measured out his life now were full of caviar, obscure reference to sainted Elagabalus. Like Tiresias in the Wasteland, half man, half woman, hits at Eliot's cobweb of obscurities, and the knowing reference to Mr. Noakes, that melancholy man, alludes to the way that Eliot liked to introduce his characters as if they were familiar friends. Exotic names such as Mr. Apollinax, Princess Volupine, and Grishkin gave way to the bathos of the very English monosyllable English name Mr. Noakes. Poetry was the alpha and omega of Jack Squire's life, said a friend. So far, I've concentrated on the literary wars of the earlier part of the century. I'd now like to turn to his work as a poet. I don't have much time to develop this, but I should just 3 or 4 extracts from some of his poems. I aim to show that he has a range which is far from the expected picture of a Georgian poet or the caricature I read earlier. I shall start with what was John Betjeman's favourite of his poems, and the poem. John Betjeman was a great admirer of Squire, and he published his first poems, and he thought Squire's music. He thought poetry was musical, beautiful, pure, and everything that he sometimes missed in the poetry of his day. So this is Winter Nightfall. The old yellow stucco of the time of the Regent is flaking and peeling. The rows of square windows in the straight yellow building are empty and still, and the dusty green dark evergreens guarding the wicket are draped with wet cobwebs, and above this poor wilderness, toneless and sombre, is the flat of the hill. They said that a colonel who long ago died here was the last one to live here, an old retired colonel, some Fraser or Murray, I don't know his name. Death came here and summoned him. and the shells of him vanished beyond all speculation, and silence resumed here, silence and emptiness, and nobody came. Was it wet when he lived here? Were the skies dun and hurrying? Was the rain so irresolute? Did he watch the night coming? Did he shiver at nightfall before he was dead? Did the wind go so creepily, chilling and puffing, with drops of cold rain in it? Was the hill's lifted shoulder so lowering and menacing, so dark and so dread? Perhaps, but he's gone now, he and his furniture, dispersed now forever, and the last of his trophies, antlers and photographs, heaven knows where. And there's grass in his gateway, grass on his footstep, grass on his doorstep. The garden's grown over, the well chain is broken, the windows are bare. And I leave him behind me, with the straggling, discoloured rags of the daylight, and hills and stone walls, and a rick long forgotten of blackening hay, the road pale and sticky, and cart ruts and nail ruts, and wind-ruffled puddles, and the slop of my footsteps in this desolate country's cadaverous clay. You can see why Betjeman admired such a poem. It has all the stamp of those poems which say goodbye, like Death in Leamington of Betjeman's or Mr. Bleaney of Larkin's. A couple of love poems. Winter Midnight, written to his wife in 1932. The wind in the woods is moaning tonight. The boughs of the pine trees are groaning tonight. The creaks of the hollies rebuke all our follies. The skies, a long dirge, are intoning tonight. Oh, would I were dreamlessly sleeping tonight, where death all our dreams would be keeping tonight, not regretfully longing over mutual wronging, awake, lying, hopelessly weeping tonight. Of course, Squire was a nature poet too, cannot be denied, but very rarely, and not in the same way that Edward Thomas or Blenheim were. He did, however, write, and I think this is a perfect evocation of the Lincolnshire landscape. It's almost Chinese in its delicacy and its precision and its stillness. It's very short. It's called Fen Landscape. Wind waves the reeds by the river. Grey sky lids the leaden water. Ducks fly low across the water. 3 flying, 1 quacks sadly. Grey are the sky and the water. Green the lost ribbons of reed beds. Small in the silence, black boat floats upon wide, pale mirrors. Finally, I'd like to read from Squire's long poem, The Stockyard. It was written after he had toured an abattoir in Chicago. He dedicated the poem to Robert Frost, whom he just met, and its conversational and opening shows something of a debt to us. The yard itself is approached by a journey on an icy grey day through thin snowflakes and wet spaces, heaps like the litter at the top of mines, scabrous cottages, dirty forlorn little shops, railway crossings, canals and telegraph poles. Sounds almost like the more socially aware poetry of the 30s that Auden would be writing. When he gets to the abattoir, there is a contrast between the offices with their rows of clerks and pretty young typists and the abattoir itself. Squire dares not look at them, overcome with the sense of blood, and then he hears a sound of perpetual scraping, A warm, wet stench, and then, still steaming, moved evenly into a hall, a line of pinkish-white pigs, atrociously naked, their unders gashed with a wound from tail to head, suspended parallel, a quivering pattern of trunks and dangling snouts and smooth, flapping, pointed ears. The visitors were next shown to cool chambers where the animals were cut up, cured, and the joints wrapped up by aproned girls. This reminded that there was worse to come. The cattle were led into the largest shed of all, and a man wielding a hammer killed the beasts. Squire continued. But some I saw that dazed fell to their knees and needed a second blow, and one that came to its knees and looked with uplifted head, bewildered, appealing, as against a dread mistake. And the loud crack drove it down, and it lay like the rest. This realism demands our pity, and the poem ends. And I thought no longer of only Chicago, but of all our haunted race and its world. And I saw in a chasm of infinite darkness, killing, devouring, and charnel smoking, writhing flames, and a rain of blood. No poet after Passchendaele would have thought only of Chicago, wrote Philip Larkin, and he included this poem in his book of 20th century verse. Squire was sure that a true poet would have wide interests and play a part in the world outside books. He described himself as a centipede with a foot in 1,000 camps. There was almost no literary club or event in which he was not present. If there was an address to be made, a fund to be launched, a statue to be erected, or a dinner to be held, he was always there, giving toast to Dickens, Byron, Lamb, Rabbie Burns, Shakespeare, or whoever else it might be. For it was not just literature that made him a man of letters. From his youth, he was fascinated by architecture, and as a founder of the Architecture Club, still thriving today, tried to preserve the best of the old and record the best of the new. He fought a long campaign to save Stonehenge from development. He tried to save the old Waterloo Bridge and opposed the spread of jerry-built houses that followed the new arterial roads of the 20s and 30s. He tried to preserve the countryside from urban spread. He thought too of a career in politics and fought 2 parliamentary elections, one for the Liberal Party and one for the Labour Party and one for the Liberals. He was one of the first broadcasters and was the commentator on the first boat race to be broadcast live on the wireless, and it was only the second outside broadcast ever. He lectured on wireless for the fledgling BBC on all kinds of topics and to a children's audience at 4:30 in the afternoon. However, his reputation sank as gradually as Eliot became the preeminent critic, editor, and literary man of his day and took over, in part, his role. His poetry began to look old-fashioned, and the magazine that he'd edited for nearly 20 years went bankrupt in 1934. Now the politics of the 30s dominated the time and the thoughts of the young poets such as Auden, Spender, and MacNeice. Their poetry, based as it was on political and social engagement, was foreign to both of the warring sides of the 1920s, whom we've been talking about. Squire continued to write during the Second World War and afterwards as the literary editor of the Illustrated London News, but his glory days were over and he fell into isolated and alcoholic silence. He died in 1958 and was buried in the small village, Broadwood Vidger, Widger in his native Dorset. Under his name, on his gravestone, is carved one word: poet. So, why should we remember him today? I think, as my title suggested, he embodied the man of letters, a man who was widely known, whose literary views and aims work at clarity, comprehensibility, and humanity. He hated the exclusivity of some of the poetry of his day, and what Cambridge wrote it, Oxford edited it, and no one read it, was his comment. When the works of modernism tend towards the difficult, obscure, and even incomprehensible, I'm thinking of Finnegan's Wake, Pound's Cantos, and Woolf's The Waves. His poetry was admirably clear and available. His life as a man of letters was dedicated to the encouragement of a wide readership. The growing spread of an educated and literate public meant a possible readership of thousands. The First World War had seen an explosion of poetry, and the Georgian anthologies had sold magnificently. Squire's Literary Monthly was the same. More and more people were able and ready to read poetry and novels and respect the writer as a guide to their lives. For a brief while in the 1920s and the 1930s, that man and that guide was John Collins Squire. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. Would anybody like to ask any questions or any comments? You're most welcome.
I think there were some of the best bits of the book there were brought back to mind there, and I'm very glad you read from the Stockyard as well, which I think really does show that he does have more to him than a lot of people seem to think.
I have a question. Can I ask my question?
Yes, go ahead.
Chesterton, Belloc, how did he relate to that guy? I agree he was an atheist, but how did he get on with him, or indeed Shaw?
Very interesting question. He was very friendly with Belloc. He went sailing with him, and he had a guide to him. Although I said he was an agnostic, he actually was very sympathetic to the Catholicism of Belloc, and very sympathetic to his views. He liked him and his sister. He liked very much as well. So Shaw, different kettle of fish altogether. Shaw was not his favorite writer. He admired him very much as a humorist, but gradually he was quite keen on Shaw when he felt that the world could be changed and that Shaw had got some good ideas about it, both Shaw and Wells. But he gradually fell out with that point of view, and therefore the Catholicism of Belloc would appeal to him much more. Very interesting question.
Chesterton?
Chesterton, very keen on Chesterton, and they had a lot in common. Chesterton was invited to play, and this was a great honour for Squire, in Squire's cricket side, and said that he was a bit too old and a bit too fat really to play in the cricket, but he would act as the wicket. But he did umpire, actually. Squire admired Chesterton very much.
Just to say, several of the people that John's mentioned tonight, Belloc, Benjamin, Sitwell, Pound, these people all lectured at Lytton Phil. Quite impressive roll call there. And we do have many of Squire's volumes in our collection. So when you are in Lichtenfield, if you want to follow up tonight's talk, please do visit our shelves, and you'll find several volumes by Squire.
I'm very pleased to hear that,
Yes.
because of course it is almost impossible to find copies of
Yes,
Squire's
we've
work
got
except
actually
for second-hand bookshops.
many more than I would have imagined in some respects, but I'm really pleased to have, when I searched the catalogue, to see so many. So
I'm very impressed.
good. Well, I'd like to bring the evening to a close. If no one else has any questions, to thank John so much for giving up his time to give us a very interesting talk, and plenty to follow up within the shelves of the Lichtenfield as well. As Keith said at the beginning, if you would like to show your appreciation to Lichtenfield, please do check out our website, and you will be able to donate whatever you see fit to Lichtenfield in order for us to continue our good work. But thanks once again to John, and with that, good night, everybody. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye.